Hi, everyone. As Alex said, I'm Bethany Allen. I'm the education coordinator, and I have been moderating these talks we've been doing the past few months. So I'm really excited to be able to share some of the things we're doing in the education department, the types of things we're looking at. And I wanted to start by talking a little bit more about the wider museum world, and then we'll focus more on Strawbery Bank. So many historic sites are engaged in a re-examination of their interpretations. The stories that they tell. And they're looking for the ways in which they can look beyond that dominant narrative. They want a more inclusive account of past events. They're looking to avoid what you may have heard referred to as the danger of a single story, which I think is a really great phrase. It highlights that need to include diverse voices, multiple perspectives, and all of this to help people find relevance in history and a greater understanding of present events through the past. And quite a bit of this work is being done around including the voices of enslaved people. And this is happening on many different levels at many different institutions. And just to give you an idea of what's out there, I wanted to mention a few, and this is really just a few examples. Mount Vernon, probably about 5 years ago now, began an exhibit that talks about the experience of enslaved people who lived there in the time of George Washington. We also have at Monticello, there is a new exhibit that just started a couple of years ago on the life of Sally Hemings. And this is drawn from the words of her son, Madison. And there is the Museum of the American Revolution, which just started an exhibit that is focused on talking about the enslaved experience in Virginia during the Revolutionary War. And this is actually a virtual exhibit. So if you go onto their website, you can take a look at what they're up to right now. And more recently, within the past year, is the Prudence Crandall Museum. This is a little bit out of our time, but it is pretty interesting, so I wanted to mention it. And it is a little bit closer to home. This is in Canterbury, Connecticut. And the museum has really started refocusing their interpretation. They're talking less about general education in the 19th century and talking more about Sarah Harris, who was a young Black woman who was admitted to Prudence Crandall's boarding school, that yellow building you can see in the picture there, and about her experiences and the white community's reaction to having a Black woman admitted to the school. And they're also getting in a conversation there about the empowerment of education. And of course, at Strawbery Bank, we represent the lives of the residents of the Puddle Dock neighborhood. This is over the course of 300 plus years, which gives us a really great and ongoing opportunity to talk about day-to-day interactions. And I mean interactions between all the people of the past that made up the Portsmouth community. And when it comes to 18th century Portsmouth, we really have an opportunity to provide interpretations that talk about, that make it clear to visitors that both enslaved and free Black people were a part of daily life and integral to the success of the city. Before we can begin this kind of meaningful discussion on slavery, however, we need to be aware of the existence of two historical myths. The first, and we encounter these at the museum, the first is that there was no slavery in the North. Our perception of slavery is so tied into the plantations of the South and what we've learned about the Civil War that most people simply don't realize that it was an institution that existed in the North. And the other is that while slavery did exist in the North, it was something that was kinder. It was more humane than slavery in the South. And this is a concept that really ignores the experience of the enslaved person and the realities of having no freedom. So even with a little bit of disbelief there that we see, we are able to throw quite a few facts out about slavery in Portsmouth in particular, New England in general. We know the first enslaved person was brought to the area around 1645, and that while the population in Portsmouth was relatively small, especially compared to cities like Boston, we know that by 1705, we have the first official notation for a Negro burial ground in Portsmouth. And this does indicate a rise in population. And a lot of authors will also talk about the obligation of the white community towards the enslaved person to provide this bit of land. And by looking at census records, we know approaching the Revolutionary War, the population of enslaved people is around 656 in Portsmouth. And really between all these numbers, what we have is a group of people, many with a rich shared heritage. They're trying to maintain cultural connections, and they really begin to form their own communities and even forms of government. Although we need to be careful when we talk about community and forms of government, which is something we talked about quite a bit this summer at the museum, because these two concepts don't mean freedom. So one of the more recent projects I've been involved with when it comes to 18th century slavery in Portsmouth is a workshop, and it's aimed at helping to dispel these myths I mentioned. And it was originally developed for teachers, but I've done it with homeschool students before too. And it's there to spark discussion and critical thinking about the lives and experiences of enslaved people, to get people to think about where white and enslaved people encounter each other in public spaces, and in what capacity, and what we can learn about the visibility of enslaved people in the eyes of white society and the law. And we're doing this primarily through looking at primary sources. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, you can see an official definition of primary sources on the slide, but basically, a primary source is anything that was produced in the time period being researched or discussed. And because, as I said, the houses at Strawbery Banke span over 300 years of history, there's quite a variety of primary sources available to us overall. We have legal documents, census forms, wills, probate records. We've got letters, journals, oral histories, newspaper articles. There's a lot of sources. That's just to name a few. But of course, the further back in time you go, the variety of sources available changes. And it can become a challenge to find sources to do with specific families or individuals. And when we're talking about marginalized groups, this difficulty is really increased. And there are many things to bear in mind when working with primary source materials. For the purpose of our talk right now, I really want to emphasize being aware of point of view. Just as you are all doubtless aware that your speaker is a white woman born and raised in New Hampshire, which brings with it its own experiences. Many of these documents, all of these documents, I should say, that we're about to look at are written by white people, and therefore from the perspective of white society in Portsmouth. And we need to be aware of what that means in terms of not representing the experience of enslaved and free Black people. So basically, when we approach these documents, we need to shift our mindset a bit, where we typically read primary sources to learn what they say. Now we kind of need to look at what is left unsaid, what we can learn from the silences that are there. So for example, we have Sherburne House at Strawbery Banke. It's our oldest surviving structure, built around 1695, and it is part of the Black Heritage Trail. We know the Sherburne family owned 2 slaves because they're mentioned in the estate inventory from around 1744. And the estate inventory reads 1 Negro, 200 pounds, ditto 1 Negro woman, 50 pounds. And this makes it clear that these people are commodities, they're property. And this actually just reminded me, there is a similar set of records from Newcastle in which there's an enslaved man listed on an estate inventory, and it gives his worth as 10 acres of salt marsh. So this isn't at all an unusual type of document. And there's no names, there's no other descriptions that are given. And when we want to talk about the enslaved people at Sherburne House, we really have to draw on our own understanding of slavery, the roles of enslaved people elsewhere in Portsmouth and other northern cities. And we can say the man probably worked at the docks, maybe in the Sherburne family's warehouse. We can say that the woman probably worked in the house, tending the garden, cooking, cleaning, maybe watching the Sherburne children. And we can at least start getting a sense of these people as individuals rather than just that number on the inventory records. We do find that you get a few more details in documents that concern enslaved individuals when they step out of the box, so to speak, who do things that are either viewed as illegal or otherwise outside of the normal expectations held by white society. For example, we have what we would refer to as a runaway ad. This is from the New Hampshire Gazette, printed in 1764. And this gives us at least a name. We see it's an enslaved man named Fortune who's run away from his owner. And there's a brief description of his physical appearance and clothing. It says he's small for his age. He was wearing a red jacket. And this is a great document to begin thinking about Fortune's experiences, where he came from, where he might go, what his life might have been like. And again, even if we don't have any definitive answers, we can at least start considering that individual experience. I should mention that we don't actually know what happened to Fortune. This is the only document we have that gives us his name. And this ad is part of the documents we look at during that workshop I mentioned earlier. And what I would like us to do now is to take a closer look at several of those other documents. We won't be able to go too in depth right now, but I think I can provide you with a good overview. And since we're dealing with 18th century life at Strawbery Banke, these documents are all focused on the Puddle Dock neighborhood, specifically around the business endeavors of Mr. John Stavers. Mr. Stavers was an English immigrant. He first ran a tavern on Queen Street, which is modern day State Street. And later in 1766, he built Pitt Tavern, which is pictured here. And this is the tavern you can visit at Strawbery Banke. Taverns were think hotel and restaurant, a place where you can get a place to sleep, a bite to eat. And during the Revolutionary War, these were particularly important as places of political debate and discussion, somewhere you could go to get the latest news. And since they're large businesses, taverns in general relied on the labor of enslaved people to keep them running smoothly. And we have already seen John Stavers' name today. In his early days at Queen Street, he owned an enslaved man named Fortune. He's the one who placed that runaway ad we looked at. And I wanted us to take a look at another of the Queen Street documents. This is a newspaper ad published in the same year as Fortune's runaway ad. And I've put it alongside an ad from his Pitt Tavern days, so it's a little bit later. And my slideshow seems to be just a little bit stuck. Give me one moment. There we go. And this is, I find it's something of an uncomfortable slide to look at, but I think the language and the sentiment behind these articles, these advertisements, is very important. Both of these have to do with entertainment, and this is entertainment specifically at the taverns, and it adds another layer to the places and ways in which white people and enslaved people would interact. So this first ad is inviting people for a small fee to come and see the current attraction at Stavers Tavern. It's an albino Negro boy. Pay a little bit extra. They'll even bring him around to your house for a private viewing. The other is for an attraction of 2 camels that are coming to the tavern. And as I said, the language here, the type of info supplied, it's all very similar. They're billed as curiosities. It provides physical descriptions, place of birth. And you'll notice there's a line in the boy's ad which says his wool is quite white, using words generally more descriptive of animals. And while this albino boy may be a singular occurrence in Portsmouth, this comparison does serve as a good jumping off point to start a discussion of general perceptions of Black men and women as something different, something not like us to the colonists. And if we're going to start considering the experience of this boy, that individual experience of all the enslaved people, we can't ignore the dehumanizing nature of slavery, which I think is pretty evident in this article. And moving forward in time, we can look at a couple of my favorite documents. These concern James. He's an enslaved man owned by John Stavers at Pitt Tavern. And the events in these documents all occurred during the American Revolution. And this is a particularly interesting time to discuss the topic of slavery because the independence is a part of daily discourse. And the colonists often compared their relationship or status as slaves to the tyranny of England, as oppressed by the British government. And of course, the Declaration of Independence would have been read publicly from the State House, so people would have been familiar with the sentiments, if not the exact wording. And I have up that famous line from the Declaration: "We find these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," something we all know really well. But at this time period, it brings up a lot of questions about freedom for who deserves to be free and why, and exploring the questions of how colonists could fight for and demand their own freedom while enslaving others. Um, and it's worth noting that we do see in the colonies at this time a rise in abolitionist sentiment. Um, but looking at the documents associated with Pitt Tavern, those documents we're about to take a quick look at, we don't really see any type of immediate change in the way these documents look at the actions of enslaved people. So to start out with, I wanted us to look at this newspaper article. This is a fairly well-known story for anyone who's interested in Portsmouth history. The incident involves an attempt to chop down the sign at Pitt Tavern. And this seems to have been an incident more widely reported in Massachusetts newspapers than New Hampshire, because it's fun to gossip about your neighbors a little bit. And this particular story is from the Essex Journal, printed in 1777. And the story goes that a mob, suspecting Mr. Stavers of being a loyalist rather than a supporter of the colonial cause, attacked the tavern, attempted to cut down the sign, and Mr. Stavers sent his enslaved man James out to stop the attack, which James did by hitting Mark Noble, the apparent ringleader, over the head with the handle of an axe. Mr. Noble does survive, although they say he was never the same again. And the newspaper makes this very dramatic. Mr. Stavers is giving the order for James to go out and kill the first person to lay a hand on the sign. And next to that, I have this, which is the deposition from this case. And this is given by John Wheelwright, who was there that evening in the tavern when this all was happening. He's also a neighbor of Mr. Stavers just down the street. And in this document, we get a slightly different story. And Mr. Wheelwright seems to say that the incident was caused mainly because of a dispute over Mark Noble's tavern bill, although we get a feeling something else is going on there as well, as if you read the document in its entirety. But one thing that stays the same from that newspaper article to this deposition is Mr. Stavers sending James out to try to prevent any trouble. James's action with the axe handle both have him hitting Mark Noble over the head with the axe, and the end result is the same. And that end result is that Mr. Stavers and not James is arrested and held responsible for these events. And while these documents kind of show us the importance of treating primary sources carefully, reading critically, more importantly for our purposes today, it also shows us the ways in which enslaved people were seen as an extension of their owners and not as their own person. I also wanted to mention, attached to this story, I don't have any sources for it, but it is interesting. They say that James was found hiding in the basement of Pitt Tavern days after this event, apparently scared for his life. And I mention this because it would not have been unreasonable to assume that James would have been held responsible for these events. We do have court cases in which enslaved people are tried and even executed. And there is a Negro court in Portsmouth, which would punish minor infractions. But there is this arbitrary nature to an enslaved person's life. So James probably, if the story is true, could not have been sure what kind of consequences he was facing. And we can see this arbitrary nature in other aspects of enslaved people's lives, from the type of work they do to where they lived, even the identity of their owner. That's all very changeable. And save the best for last. This is a really interesting document. It occurs 1 year after the sign incident. And these are documents pertaining to a case brought by John Stavers against two women, Sarah Giles and Jane Cooper. These are two separate cases, one against Sarah Giles, one against Jane Cooper. And believe it or not, these are actually my best copies of the original documents, which can be found in the New Hampshire State Archives. And these documents accuse Sarah Giles and Jane Cooper of stealing from John Stavers by the use of force and arms against James. And that's followed by a really interesting line that says, knowing that he was the servant, the slave of John Stavers. The women are found guilty, and they have to pay twofold the worth of the items stolen and cover the court costs. Each woman ends up paying just under £80 for this. And there are a few things that are worth noting in these documents. First is the absolutely absurd amount of goods that were being stolen. It's hard to imagine that there was any way for James to sneak these items out of the tavern or any of the tavern outbuildings, or that they wouldn't be missed in some way, even if Mr. Stavers' business wasn't doing quite as well during the Revolution as before it. And this brings up a lot of question about James's exact involvement in the thefts. And just to give you an idea, this is a selection of the items listed. There's 3 bushels of salt, and if Google hasn't led me astray, a bushel of salt is around 50 pounds. A 2-handle washing tub of rum, a pound of tea, my personal favorite, a ruffled shirt, very expensive, very fancy. And if memory serves, between the 2 women, there was about 20 gallons of brandy stolen. And these are, when you look closely, these are all items that are being regulated by the state in some way, limiting price or quantity, or that they have since stopped importing from England. So they're really hard to find. So that adds another layer, I think, to this document. But putting that information aside, we know from these documents that Sarah and Jane are both married women, which generally puts them in more of a protected tier of society. And we should notice that they are the ones who are specifically held accountable for events, not their husbands, which forms an interesting juxtaposition with James, who was the one threatened and forced to steal. He's the one whose voice or experience we don't hear here. He's not considered by the court. And this really begs the question of what type of recourse to the law or the ways he might have been able to seek help in this type of situation, which connects us back to that question of visibility. And I know we are a little bit short on time. I just wanted to bring up this document really quickly because so many of you got in touch with me ahead of this talk, interested in the petition for freedom. And just very quickly, it's, I sort of suppose, an end resolution of the discourse on freedom we mentioned before, the end result, I should say. And this was printed in 1780 in the New Hampshire Gazette. And it's written and signed by a number of Portsmouth slaves asking for their freedom. Prince Whipple is the name we normally see most associated with this document. The petition didn't really go anywhere. And even though it was printed in the newspaper, it was printed under the heading of "for the amusement of the reader," which still tells us a lot about that relationship between the Black and white community. But let me end really quickly. Which basically means the children of any enslaved person will not be slaves themselves. They're not free. They still have to serve almost an indentured servitude before they do find some freedom. And the last mention of a slave on the census records of New Hampshire is around 1840. But that is, of course, not where our efforts towards inclusive interpretation and the study of these types of primary source documents should end. And sorry, Alex, I went a little bit over, but do we have any questions?
And that was perfect timing. Thank you so much, Bethany. And we do have a couple questions. Just a reminder for everybody else, or for folks who came in late, you can submit your questions directly to me using the chat button down at the bottom of your Zoom window. There's a little speech bubble, and then I can read those questions to Bethany. We have about 15 minutes left for Q&A. So the first question I have for you from the audience is about whether we know anything about some of the punishments for people, enslaved people who ran away and were captured and brought back to New Hampshire.
Well, I think part of the punishment was you didn't make it to freedom. You were once again enslaved. And we do have, normally you see mentions of whipping. There may be, I'm sure there are other punishments out there, but in Portsmouth, that seems to be kind of a primary one. And there were laws against helping slaves who were trying to escape, enslaved people who were trying to escape, which also meant there were fines and punishments that could be incurred by white society for aiding and abetting this.
Great, thank you. And then I have a question. I was interested in the story you added about James hiding in Pitt Tavern. And so my question is about your perspective as a historian is a little different from mine as an archaeologist about what lines of evidence we use. And I'm a big fan of material culture and oral tradition. So I was just wondering what some practices are that historians apply to incorporate oral traditions or rumors like that into your narratives.
I haven't actually had the opportunity to use a lot of oral histories. I think when you are using sources that you are unsure of, either you need to provide, additional evidence where I can say, like, elsewhere in Portsmouth, this is what is happening. So it leads us to draw these conclusions about this particular situation. But I think a lot of it is just making it clear where those sources come from, being as transparent as possible.
Great. So another person in the audience is asking about whether we have made presentations available for high school students. And I think there's probably some larger conversation to be had about how we can reach K through 12 students with information like this and what the reaction and responses are of schools to teaching students how to engage with primary sources. So the short answer is no, we haven't invited high schools to our monthly Zoom presentations, but our education department does reach out to them. But Bethany, if you'd like to talk more about teaching students primary source material, go ahead.
It's so important to look at these primary source materials. We're so accustomed to just picking up, a history book and reading, but looking at these primary sources brings such a different level of understanding about the culture, the societies you're talking about. And as part of the education department, I can say absolutely that we are very interested in working with high school groups and getting this information out here. This is, as I said, it's a workshop that we have developed and used with students in the past. So yes, hopefully that is something we can work with you in the future and get that out to your students.
Great. Okay, another question from the audience. Beyond obviously living quarters and food, did enslaved people in New Hampshire receive any type of compensation that we know of?
Not as a regular thing. We usually talk about negotiations to get a plot of land so they could cultivate their own garden. And that's really about as far as I've seen in terms of here, you can have something that is just yours. But I think, and Alex can maybe speak a little more about this, we do see, evidence of these cultures, things that would perhaps more self-indulgent in terms of style and items on the grounds that are not necessarily something that's just handed to you by your owner, which is a terrible word to use, but by their owner. But little pieces of material culture.
Yeah, that's a great point that ties in a little bit to our next question from the audience, which is, has there been any research into the Piscataquis relationship with slave-based economies in the Caribbean? For example, merchants who are trading with plantations and owning enslaved people or transporting enslaved people. And just before I turn over to you, Bethany, to relate it to foodways and the choices enslaved people were able to make concerning consumption. We do have some archaeological evidence of tamarind being shipped from the West Indies, which is an African fruit, and was purchased by a household where we know there were enslaved Africans. So a little tie there to the Caribbean and to the archaeological record of choices. But any other research on your end, Bethany, into ties to the Caribbean?
Thanks, Alex. I think one really important thing to realize about New Hampshire was there are no tariffs here if you're on enslaved people. So this was actually kind of an important stop. You could bring enslaved people here into our harbors and not have to pay any extra. So when we talk about the places that white society and enslaved people would interact, we also need to include, down by the docks, the ships, because the enslaved people were being carried on these ships right into our harbor. So in that way, we definitely had a big role in helping carry enslaved people into the Caribbean.
Okay, that ties a bit into another question. Now I'm just picking the questions that relate best to one another.
Excellent.
But you have given us a good glimpse there into the larger maritime economy of Portsmouth in the Revolutionary period or the pre-Revolutionary period, and especially of the Puddle Dock neighborhood where so many people were relying on our proximity to the Piscataqua River. So when we're thinking about the larger economy, the question is, did you have to own slaves in order to benefit from slavery?
It's hard to say in Portsmouth. I think that is not a true statement in some other cities where it was a big business. And we see like even in Portsmouth, Studley's Tavern, John Staver's earlier tavern, things like slave auctions, which would have been bringing in business to you, even if you weren't actively purchasing a slave at this auction. But in Portsmouth, there were such small numbers of enslaved people there. And it kind of became more of a almost a status symbol to own an enslaved person. It was something, if you were from a higher tier of society, you would own an enslaved person. So it's kind of hard when you're talking about Portsmouth to talk about that kind of benefit because it wasn't exactly that kind of relationship in all spaces.
Yeah, an important reminder of the difference between different regions and their different economies. Related to status, do we have information specifically on John Langdon and whether the Langdon family owned slaves, and if so, how they were treated?
I was actually just reading about this when it's, of course, all gone out of my head the moment you asked that question. I don't specifically have that information here, but it is definitely out there. There is definitely a bit of literature about that we can find.
Okay, great.
If whoever asked that question wants to email me, I'll help you find some of those documents because I do have some of them.
Okay, yeah, perhaps when I should have mentioned, although Zoom tells us that this program is being recorded and will be shared after the fact. And perhaps when we post the recording, we could put some other resources in the notes or the YouTube description, including some of the museum exhibits Bethany talked about at the beginning and perhaps some books. Because someone else was asking about books or reader recommendations. So when slavery was officially ended in New Hampshire, or even before when some individual people received manumission, do we have any information about how they incorporated themselves into Portsmouth society and whether any of their descendants are still in the region?
Those are excellent questions. Ones that I can't necessarily answer, except to say we know there were tensions between free Black people and the white community at times. But we do see, and we know that Portsmouth itself, there was even the enslaved people were providing a lot of the skilled labor. And that carries through when we start seeing emancipation, that they're still providing a lot of the skilled labor. The one that just popped into my head is like Pompey's Bakery, which was in Portsmouth later. So they are finding places, but I'm not going to say it was always an easy, or just because we're in the north, a smooth transition.
This is somewhat related about like African American communities forming to help themselves among those tensions. But what information do we have about the relationship between Portsmouth's churches and enslaved and free people?
We know North Church in particular, the enslaved people would sit up with the children at the church. And there's an interesting there's so many different thoughts here. Some people did not want their enslaved people to become baptized in the religion because they didn't think they could fully understand, that they weren't capable of that understanding. Some white owners thought differently, and they would have educated, allowed them to be in that tradition. And that was something that they would use in terms of wanting to marry, legitimizing that marriage, taking advantage of, I won't say taking advantage, using those religious beliefs to help ease their own lives a bit. So we do know there was a fairly, active population within the church, even if they still weren't seen as equals in the church community.
Great, thank you. A couple comments specifically related to the topic of conversation around, how the community of Portsmouth or the city of Portsmouth benefited as a whole from slavery. People pointing out that the merchants here in the Piscataqua were becoming wealthy because of trade with the West Indies, and specifically the sugar trade, that ultimately Portsmouth's involvement with the Caribbean and with the sugar trade links it irreparably to the slave economy.
Absolutely.
I guess that's not so much of a question, one of those more of a comments, but I'm glad to see that conversation continuing a little bit. Another question that I think a lot about, although this one's not for me, what do we know about where enslaved people lived? So we know who the enslavers were, but where in those homes or on those properties did the enslaved people live?
That's a great question. And this is really tied into that idea we talked about earlier of slavery not existing in the North, or as a kinder form of slavery in the North. Because when you visit the South and you see the plantations, we talk about slave quarters, and that's not something we really talk about, at least in Portsmouth. Elsewhere in New England, that can be a topic of conversation, but not for Portsmouth. And we see mostly, I can't speak for James, we actually have a lot of conversations about this in the education department. Where would James's space have been? Would it be in the house? Would it have been, we talk about the kitchen spaces a lot, what kind of outbuildings might have been available. But in general, they usually talk about the enslaved people living in the houses, given kind of their own space. Usually we talk more about like attic type spaces for the enslaved people, but normally those kinds of interior domestic spaces.
Yeah, it's from my perspective as the archaeologist, it's a frustrating difference between the Mid-Atlantic and the South, where slaves' quarters were separate. And so the archaeological assemblage, we can definitively link it to the enslaved people who occupied the slave quarters. Here in New Hampshire, the assemblage is all mixed together. We have 1 minute, so let's fit in one more question and then I'll let everybody go. I think this is a broader question and a good question to consider moving forward. So beyond these primary sources, many of which we've already worked into our interpretive programs, how else does the museum show or discuss the enslaved people who lived and worked in the Puddle Dock neighborhood?
This is actually something we all discuss quite a bit at the museum, how to keep these interpretations going, how to bring the voices of the enslaved people and the Black community into all our spaces at Strawbery Bank, because as I said, this is a really important part of our story. And I think right now, again, Alex can probably speak a bit about this. We do bring in some of our archaeological evidence. One of the pieces of pottery from the Marshall Pottery site, where we know enslaved people work, is on display currently in the Horticulture Center, I believe. It's still there. Yes. We also discuss quite a bit about how we can bring this into our role-playing program. We have a fairly vibrant role-playing program, and how we can represent enslaved people that way too. So it's a huge discussion, and it's something that is talked about constantly among staff, and it's something we want to keep moving forward with.
Absolutely. And I think we have been able to do some of that today. I really appreciate everyone's thoughtful comments and questions in the chat. And yeah, thank you so much for coming. Before you sign off, I just want to remind you to stay tuned to our social media and our member newsletter if you're subscribed for news of our next virtual presentation, which will be a month from today on March 16th. And that one will be with Eric, our curator of historic landscapes, and he'll be discussing garden planning and design. So an exciting topic as we get a little closer to spring weather. So thanks again, Bethany, and thanks to you all for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Have a good
Thanks,
afternoon.
Alex.